We now switch gears to Fairley's material on Islam. He gets a good chunk of his facts right this time. In fact, I found only one mistake in part 26, and it concerns Catholicism, not Islam. There's no evidence that Muhammad's cousin was Catholic. All scholarly sources on the subject identify him as a bishop in the heretical Ebionite sect. I'll close this one with comment on what's not so much an error as a concern. In several places, Fairley concludes that certain experiences of Muhammad are evidence that he was influenced by demons. I'd say that's jumping the gun more than a little. Before concluding that, we should consider other options. For example, Fairley says that Muhammad's suicidal tendencies show he was visited by a demon, not Gabriel the angel. Now, while I don't believe Muhammad was visited by an angel, it's a non sequitur to say that his suicidal tendencies prove the visit was demonic. In his culture, as in the biblical world and in feudal Japan, suicide was often seen as an honorable way to escape disgrace, as Muhammad would have been had he been a madman as he feared. It's also a non sequitur to say that some strange but undefined experience Muhammad had as a child was inspired by a demon. Fairley doesn't say what that experience was, but something that fits is a time when he was allegedly visited by two men in white clothes, who supposedly split his body open and took out some sort of evil presence. Why not ask if this was simply a false story, or if it was some sort of delusion? Why blame demons? I ask because when we resort to demons as an immediate explanation, we really give them too much credit. We also do too much to cause paranoia and uncritical thinking. Fairley owes it to his viewers to at least consider other options. He does at least allow for mental disturbance in one instance, but he needs to consider that more seriously along with other options. One other point. It's really rather silly to point out that Muhammad has an experience in a cave, and connect that to Babylonian worship happening in caves. Not only is the non sequitur rather obvious, it's also something you can play all kinds of games with. Joseph Smith had his first vision in a forest. Does that mean his experience is okay? Come to that, it's hard to say what Fairley thinks this is supposed to prove in the first place. In any event, this vid gets a 3/4 tank rating. The second vid on Islam goes a bit downhill. Its opening paragraph is essentially plagiarized from this website, and the initial thrust of Fairley's vid is to try to connect Islam to these imaginary mysteries of Babylon the way he's connected everything else. We've already noted there's no need for that fantasy, so we need not repeat ourselves. The next step is more radical. Fairley says of the Arab pagans that Muhammad had visited while they believed that Allah, the moon god, was the greatest of all gods, in a whole pantheon of gods. Muhammad said that Allah was not just the greatest God amongst many, but that he was in fact the only God. In other words, Fairley's teaching the Canard that Allah was a moon god. The truth of the matter is a little more complicated, and it doesn't involve a moon god. Jonathan Berkey, in his book The Formation of Islam, offers a summary of the matter which has been used by more than one source on this issue, and which I checked in Berkey's book myself. I might also add that this connection of Islam's Allah to a moon god is rejected by the leading Christian apologist and expert on world religions, Dr. Winfrey Cordwin, who also helps explain the graphic Fairley uses, which he thinks proves his case. As Dr. Cordwin puts it, while there is indeed evidence for worship of a moon god in ancient Arabia, there's also evidence for the worship of Thor in Germany. But this doesn't prove that today's German Christians worship Thor. Both the Christian god and Thor would be referred to in generic terms as a god, or in German, Gott. And by the same token, the word Allah has the bearing of a generic term too. So while you can find this moon god stuff repeated in a lot of popular sources, it's really not a good idea to use it. It's not scholars who are promoting it. Now we break from Islam for a moment because Fairley does too. In trying yet again to make this connection to the supposed Babylonian mystery religions, he says the following. Well, as usual, no. This again comes straight out of Hislop, and he doesn't provide any evidence for the equation of Cush with many at all. He just says it, quote, seems that way, and he has, quote, no doubt that it is true. If you're looking for any sort of argument from Hislop, you won't find it. As for the meaning of Hogmanay, well, here's a summation by one resource which corresponds with what I found as a whole. namely that the origin of the word is uncertain, but that a connection to French is most likely. Needless to say, no one connects the name to the Babylonian religion. Returning now to Islam, we have this quote from Fairley. Now, if you think Fairley picked up the Encyclopedia of Religion and found this quote, you'd be sadly mistaken. The actual title of the book is the Encyclopedic Dictionary of Religion, and when I checked it out of my local college library, I found a problem. You know the saying that an ellipsis hides many sins? That's what happened in this case. Let's compare to the real quote. Well, that's why you should check your sources, Mr. Fairley, especially when what you use is conspiracy websites as sources. From here, much of what Fairley has to say has to do with Islam as a religion of violence, and gets into a lot of political haymaking. I'm not expert enough to go into those particulars, but let me just say that you can do far better than Fairley as a source for information on Islam. My friends at this website, which I've written an article for in the past, are a lot more informed and reliable, and you're not as likely to catch them using a third-hand quote either. This vid gets a half tank, and that's being generous. Since we've already noted that turning Allah into a moon god isn't the view of the real experts, there's also need to appeal to it as a reason for the use of the crescent moon as a symbol in Islam. In fact, officially, it isn't a symbol of Islam itself. It's a symbol for nations aligned with Islam. In that sense, it's no different than our own use of stars or Japan's use of a sun. It also happens to be true that there were pagan uses of the crescent moon as a symbol prior to the time of Muhammad. But as with the sort of connections Fairley tries to make with Catholic symbols, he needs to do much more than simply hold up two symbols and claim a connection because they look alike. After all, the crescent moon is also a staple of cartoons, including mine. Does anyone here think I'm a Muslim or a pagan because of that? Fairley gets a few things right, like that Mecca, one of Islam's most holy sites, was formerly a site of pagan worship, and that certain rituals were stolen from paganism. I'm not here to defend Islam, of course, but I expect that Muslims would argue that in taking over the site, they were doing some triumphant reclamation of their own, which I'd say is a more reasonable explanation than Fairley's idea of some sort of ideological continuity between paganism and Islam. In fact, at least one Islamic source, 111 Questions on Islam, makes that very claim, saying that Muhammad preserved the pagan rites but gave them new meaning. We really dip into some paranoia when Fairley claims that certain black cube sculptures around the world are in some way connected to the worship of the pagan god Saturn. Let's remember the lesson we got from this picture, which again isn't a Nazi basketball team. It's an example of a Native American use of the swastika at a time when Hitler was still slumming around in Austria as an unemployed bum. A black cube, by the same token, doesn't always have to represent Saturn, assuming that it actually does, which is something I can't find verified in any scholarly source. But as for all these pictures, Fairley apparently simply lifted them from this website, or one that is related to it in some way, even copying them in the same order. It's rather startling that in copying all of these, Fairley left out the next picture in the set. You see, these theorists who say the black cube is a symbol of Saturn also think the Jewish religion is corrupted by that. One of those websites even says the following. Wasn't it a little shaky for Fairley to leave that last picture out without explaining why he didn't think it was an applicable proof? It seems to me that if any of his viewers find those pictures, they're going to be a little confused, maybe even feel betrayed by Fairley's omission. Not that the points made from his pictures have any validity, but it would be too easy to suppose that Fairley was trying to hide something by leaving that one out. But what about those black cubes? Well, look at just one of them, the one in Santa Ana, California. It's part of the Discovery Science Center, and it's actually a housing mechanism for a rocket engine display, and it's also used to generate solar power. Why did they use a black cube? Here's the official explanation. In other words, this has nothing to do with Saturn. Maybe Fairley should have checked a few reputable sources instead of watching the Transformers movie and using it as a source. This vid gets a quarter tank.